She was born in a castle that breathed legends, and she would spend her entire life trying to escape the ghost stories her own family wrote for her. Princess Margaret Rose arrived at Glamis Castle on August 21st, 1930, the second daughter of parents who never expected to matter. Her father was a stuttering spare heir. Margaret was supposed to grow up comfortable and forgotten, a footnote in someone else's fairy tale. Then her uncle fell in love with a divorced American woman, and the footnote became a prisoner. When Edward VIII abdicated in December 1936, the crown crashed onto the head of Margaret's father like a punishment. Suddenly, the shy Duke of York was King George VI. Suddenly, Elizabeth was heir to the throne. And suddenly, Margaret, 6 years old and too young to understand what she had lost, became fourth in line to the crown of England. She had gained proximity to power. She had lost the freedom to use it. This is the story of the woman who had everything except the one thing she wanted: the beauty, the wit, the tiaras, the cigarettes in gold holders, the parties that lasted until dawn, and the photographers who followed her into every room. She was the most glamorous woman in Britain for decades, and she was never allowed to choose her own life. This is the story of Princess Margaret, the love she was forced to surrender, the marriage she was given instead, and the moment in October 1955 when she had to stand before the world and speak words that killed something inside her. She grew up in the golden cage of royal childhood, Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, private tutors and elaborate birthday parties, horses and dogs and summers in Scotland. From the outside, it looked like paradise. From the inside, it felt like preparation for a role she would never be allowed to define. Elizabeth was trained for the throne. Margaret was trained for nothing. She had all the restrictions of royalty with none of the purpose. She could not choose her friends without approval. She could not travel without permission. She could not speak to the press or express political opinions or do any of the thousand things that ordinary young women did without thinking. But unlike her sister, who at least had destiny to justify the suffocation, Margaret had only duty, abstract, purposeless, endless duty to an institution that would take everything and give nothing in return. By the time she reached adulthood, Margaret had developed the armor that would define her. She was beautiful, and she knew it. She was witty, and she weaponized it. She smoked in public using a long cigarette holder because proper princesses did not smoke. She drank whiskey with theatrical relish because proper princesses did not drink. She stayed out dancing until 4 a.m. at nightclubs her sister would never enter. She became, deliberately and defiantly, everything the palace did not want her to be. The newspapers loved her. They called her the glamorous one, the fun one, the princess who actually seemed alive. They photographed her constantly and dissected her fashion choices and speculated about her romantic life with the breathless intensity of fans at a sporting match. Margaret was the show. Elizabeth was the institution. The public needed both. What the public did not know, as Margaret's 20s began to unfold, was that she had already given her heart to someone she could never have. His name was Peter Townsend. Group Captain Peter Townsend was a Royal Air Force war hero with a distinguished record that included shooting down enemy aircraft during the Battle of Britain. He was 16 years older than Margaret, impossibly handsome, quietly dignified, and married to the wrong woman. He had served as an equerry to King George VI and, after the king's death, to the Queen Mother. He was part of the household. He was trusted. He was present. And somewhere in the early 1950s, proximity became something more. The affair began in the spaces between official duties, conversations that lasted too long, glances that meant too much, the slow recognition that something had started which neither of them had planned and neither of them could stop. By the time George VI died and Elizabeth became queen, Margaret and Peter Townsend were in love. He was also divorced. In 1953, divorce was not merely a social embarrassment. It was a spiritual stain. The Church of England, of which Elizabeth was now supreme governor, did not recognize the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. Townsend's wife was very much alive, and Margaret was now not merely a princess, but the sister of the head of the church that forbade what she wanted most. The trap was elegant. The escape was impossible. The world learned about their relationship in the worst possible way. At Elizabeth's coronation on June 2nd, 1953, as millions watched the young queen receive her crown, a sharp-eyed journalist observed Margaret reach out and brush a piece of fluff from Peter Townsend's uniform. The gesture was brief, intimate, instantly recognizable. Within days, newspapers across Britain and around the world were reporting what the palace had desperately hoped to conceal. Princess Margaret wanted to marry a divorced man, and the establishment was preparing to stop her. The mechanics of the trap were brutally simple. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, Margaret required the monarch's consent to marry until she turned 25. Elizabeth could not give that consent. She was supreme governor of a church that forbade what her sister wanted. If she approved the marriage, she would be publicly contradicting the institution she headed. The Archbishop of Canterbury made clear he would not perform the ceremony. The Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, advised against it. The cabinet was consulted and returned opposition. Every pillar of the establishment lined up against the match, not because they doubted Margaret's sincerity, not because they questioned Townsend's character, but because the rules were the rules, and bending them for a princess would invite questions about why they could not be bent for anyone else. The establishment's solution was exile. Peter Townsend was posted to Brussels as an heir attaché, a dignified removal that would separate the lovers by the width of the English Channel and the weight of professional obligation. Margaret could not prevent his departure. She could only watch him leave and count the days until her 25th birthday, when the decision would finally be hers to make, or so she believed. For 2 years, she waited. She visited Townsend in Brussels when she could, though the visits were chaperoned and the press followed every movement. She endured the sermons from the Archbishop of Canterbury that never named her, but left no doubt about their target. She survived the editorials that lectured her about duty, while men who had never faced such a choice sat in judgment of hers. She waited because she believed that at 25, she would be free. What she discovered as that birthday approached was that freedom had a price the establishment had spent 2 years calculating. The conditions were spelled out with the precision of an execution order. If Margaret married Townsend after turning 25, she would need Parliament's approval. Parliament would require her to renounce her rights to the throne. She would lose her place in the line of succession. She would lose her income from the civil list. She would be expected to leave Britain. She would be stripped of everything that made her Princess Margaret and forced to make a life as a divorced man's wife in exile, just like her uncle before her. The choice was not between love and duty. It was between two kinds of annihilation. As October 1955 approached, the pressure intensified. Newspapers that had once championed Margaret's cause began publishing opinion pieces about the sanctity of marriage and the special obligations of royal blood. Members of Parliament made speeches about tradition. The Archbishop delivered sermons. Even Elizabeth, who loved her sister and had tried to stay neutral, was forced to make clear that she could not protect Margaret from the consequences the system had designed. Peter Townsend returned to London in October 1955. For 19 days, the lovers met under the watchful eyes of the press and palace staff. They drove through the countryside. They dined with friends. They maintained the fiction that a decision had not yet been reached, but the decision had been made, not by Margaret, by the forces arrayed against her. She had consulted lawyers and accountants and advisers of every description. Every one of them confirmed the same bleak arithmetic. She could have Townsend, but only at the cost of everything else. The public waited with an intensity that bordered on hysteria. Crowds gathered outside wherever Margaret might appear. Newspapers printed hourly updates on her movements, her expressions, her clothing. Radio programs interrupted regular broadcasting to report sightings of the princess with her equerry. Britain had not seen such concentrated attention on a royal romance since the abdication crisis. The parallel was not lost on anyone. Would Margaret choose love and lose everything? Or would she prove herself made of different material, than the uncle who had abandoned his throne for Wallace Simpson? On the evening of October 31st, 1955, she gave them their answer. The statement was released to the press and then broadcast on radio. Its language bore the unmistakable fingerprints of careful drafting by palace officials. But the devastation beneath the formal phrases was entirely Margaret's own. "I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But, mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before any others." She spoke the words. The palace wrote them. She became the instrument of her own suffocation. There was no mention of the financial consequences she would have faced, no reference to the coordinated pressure campaign, no acknowledgement that the duty she invoked had been defined for her by men who had never faced such a choice themselves. Margaret had been given a script. She performed it flawlessly, and something inside her broke that would never fully heal. Peter Townsend accepted the decision with the dignity that had characterized everything about him. He issued a brief statement wishing Margaret well. Within weeks, he left Britain again, settling eventually in France, where he would remarry and live quietly for the rest of his life. He and Margaret saw each other only once more, decades later, at a meeting both described as cordial and unbearably sad. The public reaction was a wave of sympathy so intense it embarrassed the establishment that had engineered her defeat. Letters flooded Buckingham Palace expressing outrage. Editorials that had urged duty now lamented the cruelty of forcing such a choice. The Archbishop of Canterbury became a target of widespread criticism. The establishment had won. The victory tasted like ash. Margaret did not recover. She could not. She had done what was asked of her. She had sacrificed her heart on the altar of duty, and now she was expected to continue smiling, continue waving, continue being the glamorous Princess Margaret the public demanded. But the glamour had curdled into something harder. The wit had sharpened into cruelty. The parties became longer, the drinking heavier, the behavior more reckless. Margaret had been hollowed out by October 1955. What remained was a performance of a princess who no longer believed in the role. 5 years later, the palace found her a replacement. Anthony Armstrong Jones was a society photographer, young, artistic, fashionable, and, crucially, not divorced. He was everything Peter Townsend was not. He was also everything Margaret should have recognized as dangerous, ambitious, secretive, and drawn to her position rather than her person. They married at Westminster Abbey in May 1960, the first royal wedding broadcast on television, watched by millions who hoped the princess had finally found happiness. Armstrong Jones was created Earl of Snowdon. For a time, the marriage offered Margaret the glamour and creative companionship that palace life alone could never provide. But the marriage was corroded from the start. Tony Snowdon resented his subordinate position in the royal hierarchy. He had affairs. Margaret had affairs in return. They lived increasingly separate lives. Their mutual destruction an open secret among London society. The photographers who had once captured Margaret's glamour now captured her misery. The press that had once adored her turned vicious. They called her a parasite, a hedonist, an unnecessary expense. Her affair with Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener 17 years her junior, was photographed by paparazzi on the Caribbean island of Mustique. The images ran on tabloid front pages. The Queen reportedly called it her sister's gutter-snipe life. In 1978, Margaret and Snowdon divorced. The irony was exquisite and bitter. The princess who had surrendered Peter Townsend because the Church taught that Christian marriage was indissoluble had just dissolved her own marriage. The Church, whose rules had destroyed her first love, found room to accommodate her failure. The decades that followed were marked by isolation and illness. Margaret suffered a series of strokes that left her increasingly frail. She died on February 9, 2002, at the age of 71, having outlived Peter Townsend by only 7 years. But the cruelest irony was still coming. In 2002, The same year Margaret died, the Church of England issued new guidance allowing clergy to marry divorced persons in certain circumstances. The absolute rule that had destroyed her happiness was being quietly softened. 3 years later, in 2005, Prince Charles married Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla was divorced. Her first husband was still living. Exactly the situation that had made Peter Townsend impossible. The wedding was a civil ceremony, blessed afterward by the church. The archbishop did not object. The establishment did not mobilize. The rules that had been weaponized against Margaret were bent without comment for her nephew. Charles got Camilla. Margaret got October 1955. She had given up the man she loved to protect principles her own family would later abandon. She had sacrificed her heart to preserve rules that would be rewritten for someone else. Every year she spent married to the wrong man, every affair that filled the emptiness, every stroke that aged her before her time traced back to a choice that was made for her in a room full of men who never had to live with its consequences. The photographs show her smiling in tiaras. The record shows her broken underneath them. She was not destroyed by scandal. She was destroyed by duty, by an institution that demanded everything and returned nothing, by a church that enforced its rules selectively, and a family that asked her to sacrifice what they would not ask of their sons. Peter Townsend, in his final years, was asked about what might have been. He answered with the restraint of a man who had learned that some wounds stay open forever. He never criticized Margaret or the royal family. He simply lived his quiet life in France and let the question hang in the air like smoke from a cigarette holder. What would have happened if she had chosen differently? History refuses to answer. The palace certainly never will. All that remains is the image of a 25-year-old woman standing before microphones on the last night of October 1955, speaking words she did not write, surrendering a future she did not choose to lose, becoming the perfect princess the institution required by killing the person she actually was. She kept the crown. They took everything else. That is the story of Princess Margaret, the rebel who was broken, the lover who was forbidden, the spare who was sacrificed so the heir could reign in peace. She followed the rules. The rules destroyed her anyway. And when they changed those rules for Charles, no one even mentioned her name.